here in the fog and the cold of a typical Glasgow winter's morning. And it's hard, actually, for most of us in the independence movement to stay focused and to stay optimistic, given the fact that very little seems to be happening politically to further the cause of Scottish independence. However, there are things happening, particularly on social media. And I think there's a realization this morning, in fact, yesterday as well, on many social media threads coming from the independence movement, which is expecting a major backlash from the United Kingdom. Now, why, you might ask, would they expect a big backlash against independence right now? Well, this is in response to recent polling, which shows that support for independence is continuing to rise by another 2 percentage points. Now, as we know, the polls in United Kingdom papers are traditionally wedged at around 50% for independence, and they have been locked in that position ever since the referendum in 2014. Now, the object of the exercise, obviously, as far as the media is concerned, is to present the I think it's the misrepresented impression that independence is locked head to head with nothing actually happening, with yes and no finally balanced. Now, we know that that's not the case, because the recent polls indicated that there'd been another rise in the percentage who intend to vote for independence to 54%. Now, that also chimes with the last two polls, which also showed similar rises, but the level never appears to rise beyond about 55%. Now, this is obviously some kind of magic red line that the pollsters are perhaps encouraged not to cross over when they present their findings, particularly in mainstream media. However, the fact that independence support has continued to rise throughout the year is obviously sounding some alarm bells in Whitehall. And most of us in the movement who have been doing this kind of broadcasting and social media blogging for a while will know that whenever this happens, the United Kingdom likes to respond with a media blitzkrieg. And bearing in mind that the United Kingdom possesses almost all the levers of power when it comes to mainstream or legacy media, we can expect newspapers and all the television and radio channels controlled by the United Kingdom and its corporations to be presenting a united front, which is basically saying that Scotland is a slum, it's too poor to do anything for itself, and you should just give up all hope of ever becoming independent again. However, it's worth pointing out, as somebody said recently in an independence poll, in an independence post, I beg your pardon, that Scotland isn't actually becoming independent. It's not separating itself from the United Kingdom. It's actually dissolving the United Kingdom. It would effectively end the union completely, so the United Kingdom would cease to exist. So we're not actually separating ourselves from the rest of the UK, in inverted commas. We're actually dissolving the fundamental union itself. That's a very different thing from leaving some kind of club. Now, this isn't a club, remember. The union itself was forced upon us, largely with bribery and threats of military invasion and a naval blockade back in 1707. And so Scotland had little choice but to sign the document in 1707, much to the anger of the bulk of the population who rioted and tried to hunt down those who had signed the document. It's also worth noting, those of you who have had the misfortune to see the output of British historian Mr. Starkey, he claimed that when Scotland signed the Act of Union in 1707, it was in fact bankrupt. This is nonsense. This is actually just a lie put about by United Kingdom's own historians. And remember, history is written by the victors, and history, in terms of the Union, is basically the narrative of England as Britain. So Scotland wasn't bankrupted in 1707. It had lost perhaps half of its wealth in its attempt to set up a parallel colony in the Americas, which the English state then blocked. And actually, the naval blockade starved that colony out and ended Scotland's attempts to have its own colonies in the Americas. And that is what really weakened the Scottish economy in 1707, but did not bankrupt it. However, that brings me on to the next subject, which is the share of the United Kingdom's debts, which, according to political opinion in mainstream media, would be about 8% of whatever the United Kingdom's current debt level is. Now, the current debt level runs into the trillions. Now, a trillion, just so that you know, is 1,000 million pounds. So it's £1,000,000,000, basically. It's a lot of money. And any percentage of trillions is going to be pretty high. And according to the best guesses of an 8% share of that, would come out at about £195 billion that Scotland is supposed to pay back to England if it dissolves the Union. Now, this is a moot point, because the counter-argument to this is when Scotland separates or dissolves the Union, as I said earlier, then no debts actually exist, because Scotland is not allowed to borrow any money. It is England that borrows money from its own bank, which it instructs to create that money to lend to itself. So the debt is entirely notional. It's a paper tiger, and Scotland didn't borrow any of it. So as we become independent again, technically speaking, we have a clean sheet. We don't owe England anything. On the downside, the English government would, in negotiations, claim that because we're not prepared to shoulder our share, if you like, of the debt that they took out, that they borrowed from their own bank after asking them to create the money, which didn't exist before, entirely notional, they claim that if we didn't pay that debt when we dissolved the Union, then we wouldn't get our share of UK assets back. Now, that could take the form of a lot of different things. But in terms of UK assets, in other words, English assets, we're talking about things like embassies and foreign diplomacy, things like that, overseas territories which England owns, such as, or claims to own, such as the Falkland Islands or Gibraltar, places like that. But do we really need that? I mean, as a Scottish state, we don't actually really require that. We're perfectly capable of setting up our own embassies wherever we wish. We don't need to have a borrowed office space in an English embassy to operate our own diplomacy. Anyway, it does cost money to set up a state fully and equip it. Scotland has many of the institutions it already needs. It has, in fact, got its own tax office. It has its own benefit system. I think at the moment the only thing Scotland is really lacking is a treasury and a kind of home office to run the place. There are other institutions, of course, which would need to be entirely separated, such as the military, the defence of the realm, and also policing and the judiciary would need to be fully independent, something at the moment which they definitely aren't. And all that will cost money, but Scotland will be a wealthy nation. It will have access to all of its resources. It will own everything that is in Scotland, including all of its territories, and all of these special economic zones and free ports will simply be ended because we don't need them and we don't want them. And in fact, the selling off or the long-term leasing of vast tracts of Scottish industrial landscape to global corporations would simply end, because we would have the ability as a government of our own country to say those agreements were signed by another state. They are no longer in force, and if you want to operate in Scotland, you will be taxed exactly the same way as every other corporation in the country is taxed. You're not going to get any special treatment unless we decide to do so. So there are a lot of things which we need to clarify when it comes to what happens when we do end the Union and when we dissolve the Union and the United Kingdom is no more. What's left of the UK would essentially be England and Wales and the territory in the northern area of Ireland. And it's already been demonstrated because of various agreements that were reached after we Brexited and so on, that Northern Ireland has the right to hold any referendum it likes on separating itself from the United Kingdom every 7 years, and has continued to enjoy full access to the European free market south of the border in Ireland. So Northern Ireland is a state which the United Kingdom is really supporting, but which doesn't have the assets which Scotland has. And therefore it's more likely that if Scotland leaves the Union or dissolves the Union with England, that Northern Ireland would probably think, well, maybe now is the time that we should stop being a part of the UK and be part of a very successful Irish state south of their border. So a lot of things could happen after we end the Union, but that remains to be seen. But what would be left of the UK would be essentially England. And Wales, and poor old Wales is in this situation now where independent support there is also rising. They're beginning to see the writing on the wall for the Union. Now, that brings me to my last topic, and that is the Scottish branch of the British Labour Party, which has suffered, I think it's fair to say, its fair share of appalling scandals, claims of bullying, harassment, sexual misconduct by many of its councillors and other elected officials, who are all being either sanctioned, ejected, or even charged with various crimes. So the Labour Party in Scotland is suffering from a major problem with the kind of people that have been standing for election, and I don't think people who voted for British Labour in Scotland during the last general election had any idea just how appalling some of these candidates actually were. But on top of that, the Labour Party in England is now basically forcing the Scottish Labour Party, which made all kinds of wonderful promises about making sure that winter fuel payments were fine and that pensioners and others would not see a drop in their standard of living, and blah, 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 all sorts of promises made, none of which can now be delivered. And Sarwar is now being forced to backtrack furiously and kowtow to whatever Sir Keir Starmer says he has to do. And that means a shift now from what Labour used to represent, which was the interests of working people, and incidentally that doesn't include anybody who's disabled, a pensioner, a child, or a carer, anybody who's not actually in paid work, as it were. The Labour Party has now shifted from that to a kind of neoliberal free market capitalist model, which is exactly the same as the Tory party. So Starmer has seamlessly slid himself into almost exactly a carbon copy of what the Tories wanted to do, which is to protect the wealth of the already incredibly wealthy, and if possible increase it still further. And that was evidenced by Rachel Reeves' comment recently when she said that the economic policies of the Labour administration in London were now going to be scrutinised by various senior banking officials from big multinational corporate banking institutions that are located primarily in London, who are then going to check the economic models and policies which the government is actually implementing. Now that means that the Labour Party has decided basically to wash its hands of making any kind of economic decisions at all, and give that decision-making or veto power to bankers instead. Now, bankers, as we know, are already hideously wealthy. The banks themselves have been bailed out umpteen times by you and I, the taxpayer, most notably in 2008, when they themselves nearly bankrupted their entire industry by attempting to lend money to people who couldn't repay it. But now we're seeing a shift of power from the UK government to banks in terms of how the United Kingdom's economy is configured. Now that is something which a Scottish Treasury should never do. And when we do finally become a nation state again and we dissolve this union, we'll have the opportunity to take back the kind of powers that Sir Keir Starmer has so casually given to the banking industry, which are obviously his pals, and return it to where it should be in central government, when we have our own treasury and our own experts making these choices and decisions properly, without the interference, the bribery, the coercion of these multinational banking corporations, these financial institutions, which are completely unaccountable to the electorate here in Scotland. All of which leads me to believe that Scotland is moving further and further away from England as Britain in terms of its political aspirations. We know that we hold all the wealth in terms of renewable energy, and what remains of our fossil fuel as well, all of which is bankable and all of which can be used to support a Scottish currency, because we know from previous experience in 2014 that the England as Britain state is going to be vicious and nasty and withdraw the use of the UK pound sterling to Scotland when we do finally dissolve the union. So we will need our own currency. A Scottish pound would be a hard currency initially, backed by all of these massive assets which we would then own. And our currency would be as strong as ever. In fact, it would be a lot stronger than the UK pound, and of course we wouldn't have the national debt crippling us, and we could invest in our public infrastructure in a huge spread out of jobs and opportunities all across Scotland. The Highlands, the Islands, and everywhere else could be improved dramatically over the coming years. So the prospects for independence have never looked better. The polls are showing continued rising support among the population for independence, and all we're doing now is waiting for the political parties of independence to catch up and realise that the people who do want independence are going to demand that these parties take some action in 2026. Anyway, that is it from Inde-Car today. I apologise for the infrequency of these programmes, but at the moment my working schedule is pretty hectic, and in the run-up to Christmas, as ever with most self-employed people, I have to work like a dog in order to make up for the fact that while I'm on holiday for a few days, I'm not going to be earning any money. So apologise for that, but in the meantime, please, if you want to keep supporting Inde-Car, you can still do so, and I will post further links to my PayPal account so that you can keep up your support. Inde-Car is not going away. It may become a little bit less frequent as basically working conditions have changed over the past few months, and it's becoming colder, and of course we all need more money to pay the ridiculous energy bills which we're being forced to pay because England is taking all of our energy, giving it to these multinational corporations and selling it back to us at overinflated prices. A very typical act of a colonial situation where the local people whose energy it is don't get it at cost price. So all in all, Scotland is looking good for independence. We just need to make sure that our independence parties are actually working, if not together, but at least pushing in the same direction and not undermining one another, particularly when it comes to the Holyrood elections in 2026, where we really need to get a massive pro-independence majority into Parliament so that that Parliament can take back its powers, hold the referendum, and give us the chance to vote to end this ridiculous union before we're dragged any further down the plug hole by the UK. Anyway, that's it for me today. It's a lot to digest. I'm sorry, I'm trying to compress so many things into this broadcast, but I'll keep doing my best to keep you informed as much as possible over the coming months. I just wanted to read a couple of comments to see how things are going. Somebody says the currency we use is irrelevant, but the opposition will play that card. Well, we've already seen that, and they will keep playing that card. But it doesn't matter what currency we use, as long as we're no longer in the United Kingdom. Anyway, I'll see you soon. Thank you for watching this far, and I'll try and make another broadcast sometime in the later part of this week, towards the end of the week. That's it from Inde-Car today. I'll see you soon, but remember to keep the faith. Bye for now.